It was October 26, 1942. The Japanese command in Tokyo transmitted an urgent message to the entire empire. The American aircraft carrier USS Enterprise has been sunk. It was the first time. It wouldn't be the last. In November, another message: the Enterprise has been destroyed. In December, yet another: the ghost ship has finally been sent to the bottom. 3 times the enemy celebrated its demise. 3 times they raised goblets for victory. But in the dark waters of the South Pacific, around an island called Guadalcanal, the Enterprise continued sailing, wounded, smoking, with decks deformed by the heat of explosions and hangars transformed into infernos, but sailing. This is the story not of a ship, but of a turning point, of how a single aircraft carrier, the last great American naval bastion in the Pacific, carried on its decks the weight of an entire campaign. How it became the invisible axis, the pillar that held up the front line when everything crumbled around it. This is the story of the USS Enterprise and how it refused to sink. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Guadalcanal, we must go back to the morning of December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The attack was devastating, but the deepest blow was not what was seen on the surface. It wasn't the sunken warships or the destroyed planes on the ground. It was the systematic elimination of a weapon that the Japanese knew to be the key to dominating the Pacific: American aircraft carriers. On that day, by pure chance, none of the 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were in port. The Lexington was delivering planes to Midway, the Saratoga was in San Diego, and the Enterprise was returning from a mission to deliver fighter jets to Wake Island. It passed only 200 miles from the attack. Its crew heard the distorted distress transmissions on the radio. They saw in the distance the black smoke rising on the horizon. At that moment, the naval chessboard was turned upside down. From a once powerful fleet, the United States saw its Pacific front line reduced to just 3 floating naval capitals, and Japan knew it. Its strategy of southward expansion to cut supply routes between the US and Australia depended on a single factor: keeping American aircraft carriers at bay. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Lexington was sunk. In June, at Midway, the Yorktown was lost. In August 1942, when the first wave of American Marines landed on the beaches of Guadalcanal, the situation was one of silent desperation. On paper, the U.S. still had ships, but in reality, in the South Pacific theater of operations, there was one and only one fast, combat-ready aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. It was no longer just a piece in the game, it was the entire game. Guadalcanal was no ordinary island. It was a geographical trap, a mountainous, jungle-covered piece of land with a hidden secret on its northern coast, a perfect plain. The Japanese were building an airstrip there, Henderson Field, and that airstrip transformed everything. Whoever controlled Henderson Field would control the air around the island, and whoever controlled the air would control the sea, and whoever controlled the sea would control who arrived at or left Guadalcanal. The campaign, therefore, would not be decided in the jungle, but in the deep water strait that the Americans would call the slot, the corridor. It was through there that the Japanese would send their reinforcement convoys almost every night on missions that would become known as the Tokyo Express. Cruisers and fast destroyers glided through the darkness, unloaded troops and supplies, and bombarded the airstrip before fleeing back. The American Navy's mission was impossible: to interdict these routes. But how? Without sustained air superiority, any surface ship venturing near the island during the day was an easy target. The response was a deadly dance. The Enterprise's planes, and later those of the other carriers that would arrive, would have to patrol a vast sea, attack convoys, escort American transports, and protect Henderson Field, all at the same time. It was a war of logistics. Every barrel of gasoline, every artillery shell, every K-ration that reached the Marines ashore depended on a fragile naval umbilical cord, and that cord was about to be strangled. And at the center of this hurricane, there it was, the USS Enterprise, CV-6, affectionately called by the crew Big E, or the Gray Ghost. It wasn't the biggest, nor the newest. It was the second of the Yorktown class, just over 250 meters long and with a crew of about 2,200 men. But what it carried wasn't measured in tons. It was experience. The Enterprise had already been at the center of almost every major American action in the Pacific up to that point. It launched the first American planes to encounter the Japanese fleet before Pearl Harbor, by sheer luck not finding them in time. It attacked targets in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. It was at Midway where its dive bombers helped sink 3 Japanese aircraft carriers in 5 minutes. The crew was a mix of hardened veterans and determined rookies. The commander, Captain Arthur C. Davis, and later Admiral Thomas Kincaid, knew that every decision they made carried colossal weight. There was no room for error. There was no twin ship to cover its flanks. On Guadalcanal, the Enterprise would not be an offensive sword as it was at Midway. It would be a shield, a mobile bodyguard. Its mission was to be there, simply to be present. Its mere existence in the theater of operations forced the Japanese Navy to act cautiously. It was a magnet that attracted the enemy's attention, a prestigious target that the Japanese desperately wanted to eliminate. And they would try, with everything they had. The first days of August were filled with feverish tension. The Enterprise patrolled south of the Solomon Islands, its radars scanning the horizon 24 hours a day. At each dawn, squadrons of Wildcat fighters and Dauntless dive bombers took off from its decks. Their missions were multiple: reconnaissance over the slot, attacking any Japanese ship sighted, escorting the fragile American transports approaching the island, and providing air cover for the Marines on land. The pilots operated at the absolute limit. The distance to Guadalcanal was so great that they often flew with minimal fuel, relying on favorable winds to return. And the enemy was always present. Not only in the skies with the agile Zero fighters, but also beneath the waves. Japanese submarines, the Wolves of the Pacific, patrolled the known routes of the aircraft carriers. The Enterprise had to perform constant evasive maneuvers, changing course every few minutes, a deadly tango with invisible torpedoes. On board, life was an exhausting cycle. Aircraft launches, recoveries, rearming, refueling, and launches again. The men slept in shifts of a few hours next to the bombs and fuel tanks. The smell of aviation fuel, hot oil, and strong coffee permeated the ship. And on the horizon, always, the expectation of attack. They knew the Japanese were looking for them. It was only a matter of time before they were found. October 26, 1942 dawned with a heavy sky over the sea north of the Santa Cruz Islands. 2 American carrier groups, the Hornet and the Enterprise, faced a powerful Japanese fleet of 4 carriers. What followed was a classic carrier duel, a grim repeat of Midway, but this time under low clouds and rain showers. The first waves of attack clashed in the sky. The Hornet was hit squarely, becoming a giant pyre, and then, shortly after 11 a.m., it was the Enterprise's turn. From high above the clouds, Japanese Val dive bombers began to descend. The ship entered a tight turn, unleashing a curtain of anti-aircraft fire into the sky, a storm of steel with 20mm and 40mm projectiles. The first 250-kilogram bomb struck the stern, near the stern, passing through the flight deck and exploding on the third deck. The shockwave killed dozens of men instantly. Minutes later, a second bomb struck near the superstructure, scattering shrapnel throughout the forecastle. Fires broke out. Hydraulic systems failed. One of the aircraft elevators became stuck, twisted like aluminum foil. But the Big E didn't stop. While firefighters battled the flames with hoses, the anti-aircraft gunners continued firing. And even more incredibly, the damaged flight deck was still operational. Planes that were airborne, running out of fuel, were recovered with extreme care on the warped metal. The Enterprise, bleeding and smoking, continued launching and receiving planes for another 2 hours. It had survived, but the price was high. The Hornet was lost, the Enterprise was severely damaged, and the Japanese, seeing the enormous column of black smoke, transmitted news of its destruction to Tokyo. It was the first time they had declared it dead. They would be wrong. The war in the Pacific was also fought on the airwaves. Japanese propaganda, broadcast by the famous Tokyo Rose, was a sharp weapon, and nothing was more valuable to morale than the destruction of a symbol. The Enterprise was the last of the original large American aircraft carriers still operational. Its demise would be a monumental psychological victory. Therefore, after Santa Cruz, the propaganda machine was activated. Official communiques announced the certainty of its sinking. Radios throughout the empire played patriotic music. For the Japanese pilots and sailors, it was a relief. The ghost had been exorcised. But in the Solomon Islands, while the Enterprise dragged itself south toward Noumea for emergency repairs, an American intelligence team had an idea. They didn't deny the communique. Instead, they fueled the silence. They let the news spread. Meanwhile, in makeshift docks, hundreds of workers performed a miracle. Day and night they welded, replaced steel plates, repaired cables and systems. In record time, the Big E was operational again. And then, in November, when the Japanese launched a major final attack to retake Guadalcanal, who appeared on the horizon to confront their battleships? The same Enterprise, declared dead weeks before. The appearance was a shock, and when it survived the furious air raids of those days, the Japanese had to announce, once again, its sinking. The cycle would repeat itself once more. It was a tragic farce. Each death announcement made the ship more legendary, each reappearance more demoralizing. The Enterprise was not just a battleship, it had become a real ghost, a haunting presence that the enemy could not kill. While the Enterprise recovered and returned to action, the war around Guadalcanal descended to a new level of sheer brutality. These were the night battles of the corridor. Without the Enterprise's daytime air cover, the American surface fleet had to confront the experienced Japanese ships in the dark. Heavy cruisers like the USS San Francisco and USS Portland engaged the powerful Japanese battleships Hiei and Kirishima at close range, exchanging cannon volleys that lit up the night like lightning. Destroyers launched suicidal torpedo attacks. The sea north of the island became known as the Iron Bottoms, so littered with the wreckage of sunken ships that ships sometimes ran into them. The Enterprise, operating further south, was the nerve center of this defense. Its planes conducted daytime reconnaissance to locate enemy ships. Its pilots attacked any target they found. But the pressure was unbearable. Every plane lost was a tragedy. Every pilot shot down, irrecoverable. The ship operated on a blood that couldn't be easily replenished, 100-octane aviation gasoline. When the tanks ran low, it had to retreat to refuel, leaving a dangerous vacuum. The campaign became a war of mathematical and cruel attrition. How many Japanese ships could be sunk before the Americans ran out of ships? How many planes could be lost before there was no way to protect Henderson Field? The answer to these questions depended, to a large extent, on the resilience of a single aircraft carrier. In late November 1942, the USS Enterprise was exhausted. Its hull still bore the scars of Santa Cruz. Its boilers were worn down from months of continuous high-speed operation. Its crew was on the verge of physical and mental exhaustion. The commander knew that another battle could be the final blow. The decision was one of the hardest of the campaign: to withdraw the Enterprise for complete repairs. On December 4th, it departed the South Pacific, escorted by a screen of destroyers bound for Pearl Harbor. Its departure created an agonizing silence in the Allied command. Now, officially, there were no more American aircraft carriers in the area. The defense of Guadalcanal would fall to the aircraft based at Henderson Field, the so-called Cactus Air Force, and to the desperate courage of the surface fleet. But the withdrawal of the Enterprise was not a defeat. It was an act of strategic preservation. Sending it to the shipyard meant that it could return. And it would return stronger. Meanwhile, on Guadalcanal, the situation began to change. The night naval battles, though costly, had broken the Japanese capacity to reinforce the island en masse. The Japanese troops on land were hungry and sick. The tide was slowly turning, and the ghost of the Enterprise, even in its absence, still loomed over the campaign. The Japanese were never quite sure if it had truly gone away, or if it was just another of its ghostly apparitions. On February 9, 1943, the Japanese High Command made a humiliating decision: to evacuate Guadalcanal. In a brilliant covert operation, they withdrew some 10,000 surviving soldiers, abandoning the island to the Americans. The 6-month campaign was over. It was the first major Japanese land offensive that failed in the war, and it was an undeniable strategic turning point. Japan lost the initiative in the South Pacific forever. But what was the Enterprise's role in this victory? It didn't fire a single cannon shot at an enemy ship. It didn't land a single Marine. Its role was more subtle, more profound, and more vital. The Enterprise was the deterrent factor. Its presence forced the Japanese Navy to commit its own aircraft carriers to risky battles, such as Santa Cruz, where they suffered irreparable losses of experienced pilots. It was the time provider. By holding the line month after month, it allowed American industry to awaken. New Essex-class aircraft carriers were on their way. New battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were being lowered from the launching ramps. The Enterprise held the door until reinforcements arrived. It was, above all, the symbol of resilience. For the Marines ashore, knowing that the Big E was there, somewhere in the ocean, was an immeasurable psychological comfort. It embodied the promise that the Navy had not abandoned them. The USS Enterprise survived the war. It became the most decorated American ship of World War II, accumulating 20 battle stars. It fought in the Solomon Islands, the Philippine Sea, Leyte, and even faced kamikazes. But no chapter of its long career was as defining as those crucial months in 1942 around an obscure island in the South Pacific. It wasn't invincible. It was hit by bombs, torpedoes, kamikazes. It was declared dead countless times. But the Enterprise's true legacy on Guadalcanal wasn't its physical indestructibility. It was its operational persistence. At a time when the United States had nothing else to put on the front line, it was there. When logic dictated retreat, it remained. When the enemy considered it exterminated, it resurfaced. Guadalcanal wasn't won by a single hero or a single battle. It was won by a sum of uncommon acts of courage, on land, in the air, and at sea. And in the center of that sea, supporting the entire fragile architecture of the campaign, was a gray aircraft carrier, stained with smoke and sweat, sailing against all odds. The USS Enterprise refused to sink, and in doing so, ensured that an island and perhaps an entire theater of war would not sink as well.